It all started at a bustling slave market, where our protagonist encountered a slave whose demeanor was anything but humble. With a touch of disdain, she commented on how envy gripped her as she watched commoners wander about with idle ease. Her audacity intrigued him, and on a whim he chose to purchase her. Not long after, he invited her to partake in some food, offering the remnants from the day before. She refused outright, incredulous that he would expect her to eat the same fare as the masses, asserting that water and flour were more than sufficient for her. Despite this, he handed her a slice of pizza, which she promptly began to savor. She remarked that she had never experienced such richness and apparent unhealthiness, the flavor so intense that she struggled to identify it. Once they reached his home, she surveyed the space with a discerning gaze, noting that despite its disarray, the room could suffice as living quarters. He then explained that it was merely the storage area. He then led her to a bed, gesturing that it would be where she would rest. However, the woman was taken aback, unable to fathom the notion. She retorted that if she were expected to clean, she might as well tend to all the beds in the house, not just that particular one. Later, he discovered her curled up on the floor beneath the bed and asked, bewildered, what she thought she was doing. Calmly, she explained that she couldn't possibly sleep in the same bed as a commoner, and that the spot on the floor seemed the most comfortable option. Despite her stubbornness, he remained concerned for her well-being and offered her some of his own clothes to wear. In response, she raised an eyebrow, questioning if he truly expected her to don the same attire as common people. He persisted, urging her to take the clothes so she wouldn't catch a cold. He mentioned that there was a public bath nearby, but she flatly refused to set foot in a place where commoners bathed. Instead, she suggested he not worry about her and declared that jumping into the nearby river would suffice. Its strong current, she claimed, would clean her just fine. Moments later, as he soaked in the public bath, she scolded him from the riverbank, pointing out how filthy he still looked despite being a commoner. When he urged her to hurry up and undress to join the water, she shot back that she had already bathed and added, with disdain, that he was still unclean, much to his irritation. On another occasion, the slave, whom he now viewed as absurdly arrogant, carried a basket filled with bread. She remarked on how lazy commoners were for buying food meant to last half a year at once. He countered by explaining that the amount of bread in the basket would barely last 3 days. As they continued their routine, he asked if she needed anything else since he had finished shopping. Nevertheless, she replied that, unlike commoners, she typically had all she needed, water and air. Perplexed by her response, he jokingly asked if she was perhaps a plant. At another moment, noticing that she only had sandals, he handed her a pair of leather shoes he'd purchased for her. She remarked that the shoes appeared to be as costly as those worn by commoners. Though she deemed them a frivolous expense, she thanked him and quipped that she would eat them bit by bit on special occasions. Not long after, a messenger arrived with an unusual letter inscribed on parchment. Assuming it was a summons from the Lord, he inspected it carefully. The slave, however, observed that the parchment was made of sheepskin and, upon smelling it, commented that it smelled delectable. Just as she was about to take a bite, our hero quickly intervened to stop her. He then told her that they needed to head to the Lord's estate, a journey that would take roughly 2 days on foot, and instructed her to bring the horse. Predictably, the foolhardy slave responded earnestly, saying she understood and, though unsure if she could carry such a large animal herself, she'd do her best to manage. With the horse now part of their traveling party, our hero began praising the animal, noting how it could carry baggage for days and admiring its beautiful, glossy coat. The slave, however, took this as a challenge, insisting that she too could carry heavy loads and proudly declaring that her hair was just as beautiful and glossy as the horse's coat. She even went so far as to mention that her morning droppings had been quite substantial, which finally prompted him to snap and demand that she stop this absurd competition. Upon returning home, she inquired about what the Lord had said. He explained that the Lord intended to wage war and that he would likely be summoned again soon. With a chilling lack of concern, she remarked that it sounded difficult but that manual labor was a commoner's specialty. so he shouldn't worry too much. After all, he would surely return in one piece. As he began preparing for his departure, she surprisingly acted like an overprotective mother, asking if he had packed a handkerchief, spare underwear, wine, steak, and even a soccer ball for breaks. Her questions left him bewildered, prompting him to ask if she thought he was going on a picnic rather than heading into battle. She then pondered aloud why slaves weren't ever summoned for wars, to which he suggested it might be because fighting in battles was considered a position of honor. Frustrated at the thought of having to stay behind, she joked that she could participate if he carried her as part of his luggage. He shot back that she'd be far too heavy for such a plan. With her master now absent, she let out a yawn but quickly scolded herself, insisting that a slave shouldn't act so lazily. It was clear she was relaxing too much. As a form of self-punishment, she decided she would spend the time until her master returned by sitting on an imaginary chair, refusing to give in to actual comfort. She muttered to herself about how dull it was to be a slave with no master around and suddenly wondered if she should try doing something a commoner might do to pass the time. Acting on this thought, she found herself using a cup to drink water, and was immediately horrified. She exclaimed to herself how disgraceful it was, realizing that using a cup was such a commoner habit. Moments later, she found herself facing a new internal struggle, the temptation to pick up a piece of bread and dip it into the sauce lingering on her master's dirty plate. The thought sent her into a panic as she questioned whether she had lost all sense of pride as a slave. She lamented that indulging in such rich food might transform her into a commoner, leaving her deeply conflicted. Days passed, and our hero finally returned from the war. She greeted him at the door, welcoming him warmly and noting how tired he looked. She soon congratulated him on his safe return. He collapsed onto the bed, explaining that all he wanted was a few days of rest. Though he told her to rest as well, she knelt by the bed with her hands clasped in prayer, insisting that she preferred to pray for his recovery rather than sleep until he was fully restored. In response, our hero teased her, joking that the next thing she would claim was that she knew how to perform black magic. When he finally woke up, he discovered her sound asleep by his side, and a smile spread across his face as he realized that exhaustion had overtaken her pride. Recognizing her genuine concern, he affectionately decided to let her rest. Next to her, however, he spotted a note and a small hammer. The message instructed him to hit her with the hammer when he awoke to rouse her. Just as he considered following the instruction, a loud knocking reverberated through the house, startling them both and waking the slave instantly. The commoner wondered aloud who could be at the door, preparing to open it. But the slave sprang to her feet, insisting it was preposterous for a commoner to have to open their own door. She quickly took charge, flinging the door open and coming face to face with an unfamiliar figure outside. The visitor became visibly excited upon seeing them. Our hero, standing just behind her, wondered who this person might be. To everyone's surprise, the visitor recognized him as the commoner who had performed extraordinary feats in the recent battle. Without hesitation, she tossed a heavy pouch to the ground, declaring that the hero deserved a reward for his efforts. The visitor, revealed to be a young noblewoman, enthusiastically insisted that they accompany her to her mansion, promising a proper reception befitting the hero's valor. It was then that our protagonist realized this spirited guest was none other than the Lord's daughter. Upon arriving at the grand mansion, the young lady playfully ordered the slave to perform some entertaining task. However, the slave sharply reprimanded her, declaring that she should not address her so casually, as the only master she acknowledged was the man standing before her. Mortified by her insolence, our hero hastily apologized for her behavior. The Lord's daughter, reflecting on his recent heroic deeds, then extended an invitation for him to become a knight in her estate. Deeply honored, he graciously accepted the offer. Turning to his slave, he shared the news of his newfound achievement, expecting some form of celebration or acknowledgement. To his surprise, she merely shrugged and remarked that such success had always been expected from her master, displaying her usual air of indifference mixed with pride. The slave, lost in thought, mused aloud that if her master were to become a knight, she would naturally be his exclusive slave. She then cautiously wondered if this elevation might warrant an increase in her meals, from one every 4 days to one every 3. The Lord's daughter, horrified upon hearing this, turned to him and accused him of being a brute for not feeding his slave daily. Later, as the Lord's daughter searched the house for our hero, she found it peculiar that no one was in the main room. Suddenly, the slave slid out from under the bed, startling her with a sharp command to stop shouting. She informed the noblewoman that the master was currently in the bathroom. The unexpected sight caused the young noble to jump back in fright. The girl later voiced her concerns to the commoner, complaining that his slave was behaving strangely. With a shrug, he casually replied that she had always been that way, dismissing the matter with an air of familiarity. The slave, however, paid no mind to the conversation and instead began examining the bed's construction with evident admiration. This prompted him to teasingly ask if she had decided to take up carpentry as a new hobby. The Lord's daughter then recalled something important and revealed that she had prepared a new set of armor for him, meant for his duties as a knight. At this, the slave unexpectedly volunteered to join him in the next battle, suggesting she could make do with the old armor. Both he and the noblewoman reacted instantly, shouting in unison that such an idea was absolutely out of the question. The slave raised an eyebrow at their synchronized response, noting the amusing synchronicity between them. Later, our hero came across the peculiar scene of his slave and the Lord's daughter engrossed in a game. As the rounds progressed, the noblewoman grew increasingly frustrated, unable to conceal her irritation after losing yet again. The slave, unfazed, remarked that she was willing to give up her dignity for even the slightest chance at winning some coins, tokens though they may be. Then, with a sudden realization, she added that it hardly mattered, since she had never possessed any dignity to begin with. Sometime afterward, the Lord's daughter discovered the slave still awake, quietly seated by the window. She commented gently that the slave must be worried about her master, to which the latter paused, reflecting on the observation before responding with a mixture of resignation and quiet devotion. The slave, however, replied that she trusted him and saw no problem in staying up. The young lady, in turn, insisted that she sleep as 4 days had already passed. On another occasion, the noble offered a new dress to the slave and asked her to go clean herself up. The slave, however, looked at the clothes with a disdain and asked if the frills were made of lettuce, which left the Lord's daughter completely confused. Shortly after our hero returned from war, he explained that the conflict had been between 2 nations and that he would probably have to go back to the battlefield soon. At that moment, the Lord's daughter looked at the fighter and complained that the 2 of them looked more exhausted than he did, and with that demanded the commoner educate his slave better. The commoner then asked his slave what she had done this time, but the poor thing only claimed innocence. The young mistress then complained that this had been the first time she had to order a slave to do the bare minimum to stay alive, like sleeping and eating. Before he left for another battle, the Lord's daughter encouraged him in a rather violent way, telling him to go and crush his enemies. Meanwhile, the slave said she would take care of the preparations for the victory festival, to which our hero asked them not to get too carried away. Upon returning wounded, he rested on his slave's lap. She commented that he looked completely exhausted, more like a slave than she did. Our protagonist asked if she was worried, but she only said she wouldn't forgive him if he tried to steal her place. Later, the Lord's daughter appeared at his home and upon finding only the slave, asked where the commoner was. She informed her that the master was sleeping in his room. The young noble then asked her to pass along a message later. The message was a compliment. The noble said he had done well in the last battle, too, and that she was counting on him to keep it up. However, the slave commented that if the knight kept fighting like that, he would eventually die. But the noble's daughter merely asked what was wrong with that, and with chilling indifference stated that dying for one's lord was a knight's duty. At that moment the slave grabbed her tightly. The noble, startled, asked why she was holding her, and the slave responded that she would never allow her master to die for someone else's sake. The Lord's daughter, furious, threatened the slave, saying it was already too late for regrets, and that she'd have her torn to pieces. She continued yelling, furious, demanding the slave remove her hands and treating her with disdain. The slave in turn, with a cold gaze, said that the noble's unpleasant behavior needed to be corrected. And then, without hesitation, she landed a direct punch to the lord's daughter's face. The guards appeared and, seeing the affront, were shocked. They immediately accused our hero of treason and shouted that they would kill him right there for it. Suddenly, a noise of something falling drew everyone's attention, and the guards, shocked, asked who it was. And well, it was the slave who, upon seeing our hero, expressed her relief that he was still alive. Next, the guard scolded the slave, questioning what kind of servant didn't put her master first. However, they quickly cut the chatter and said they could think about that after sending her and her master to hell. Faced with the threat, the slave simply stared at them as the guards' blades approached. But in a sudden, swift move, she launched herself at them, and soon the sound of clashing steel echoed throughout the place. With impressive agility, she managed to disarm one of the guards, taking his sword for herself. And what followed was a massacre, with the slave eliminating the soldiers one by one in a brutal and efficient manner. Our hero just watched everything, stunned, unable to react. After the battle, the slave, now covered in blood, turned to her master and apologized, saying that because of her, they had no choice but to flee. And well, the commoner could barely believe what had just happened. As she carried him on her back, he asked her about her strength and who she really was. But the slave replied that she was just focused on her duty as a horse and that, unlike her, at least he should act like a human being. During a moment of rest, he found a fruit and said it was edible. The slave, however, refused to eat the same food as a commoner and instead showed a huge beetle, saying that looked much tastier. Our hero commented that, even for him, being carried all the time was annoying. However, the slave said the wounded should stay quiet and let themselves be carried. And when she offered to carry him on her shoulders, he asked if she was a circus performer. The slave quickly asked if he was being sarcastic, but he explained that he was just thinking about his grim fate, and she interrupted him, saying a third option had appeared on the horizon. That third option was an abandoned village they spotted in the distance. Already in the village, he examined the ruined houses, but the slave, with her usual irony, called the place luxurious and a perfect hiding spot. Soon, a noise alerted them, making them stop abruptly. That's when a woman in simple clothes appeared, greeting them shyly and saying she hadn't seen anyone around for a long time. In that instant, both the hero and his slave reached the same conclusion, recognizing that the woman totally looked like a country bumpkin. Later, the woman, now a bit tipsy, served a drink to the commoner and commented on the rumor that the slave had hit the lord's daughter. The slave, furious, threatened her, asking why she was serving her master. But our hero told her to calm down. Sitting at the table, he asked the woman why she was alone there, and she explained that everyone had fled because of the war, but she was left behind because she had been taking a nap. The slave then asked her why she hadn't simply followed the others. But the woman replied that when she tried to leave, she came upon a horrific scene, a sea of blood, probably from a bandit attack. The next morning, the woman woke them up cheerfully, already making breakfast and inviting them to sit. The slave, irritated by the host's excitement, threatened to knock her out. The bumpkin then revealed another reason for staying there. She was waiting for her younger brother, who had been drafted into the war a year ago. The slave, without any emotion, said he was dead, prompting our hero to scold her for her excessive bluntness. The woman protested, saying that couldn't be true, as her brother, even as a peasant, was a known soldier in the pride of the village. The slave, meanwhile, kept eating, indifferent to her despair. The poor woman reflected that her brother would never lose to anyone in that army. At that exact moment, knocks on the door interrupted her thoughts. Soon, the woman got up to answer, wondering if it was another unexpected visitor. At the door stood a soldier who introduced himself as a member of the army and said he was looking for some wanted fugitives. In the background, the commoner and his slave were eating together. Our hero, sensing the soldier outside, commented that they had been found rather quickly. The soldier, now inside the house, explained that he'd heard rumors about a lunatic slave who preferred terrible conditions and figured they'd be in that village. The commoner then blamed the slave for being discovered. Next, The soldier cleaned his enormous sword, making his intentions increasingly clear. Our hero, uneasy, asked him what he intended to do with them. The soldier revealed himself as a knight and said that although he could just call his men to kill them, he wanted to be fair and thus proposed a duel. The commoner said it was a tempting offer, but unfortunately, his leg was still injured, making it impossible for him to fight. The knight then made a sarcastic comment, pretending to feel sorry for the situation. Seeing that, the slave quickly stood in front of her master to protect him, brandishing her sword. Outside the house, the knight said that even though she was a woman, he wouldn't go easy on her, as the young noblewoman would reward him for capturing them. The slave, in turn, asked what kind of reward their lives would bring him. With a mocking laugh, the warrior seemed to enjoy the situation. That strange behavior made him think she wouldn't hesitate to step on his face, leading him to conclude that the real criminal there was the commoner who controlled her. With a superior air, the knight then asked if she had any last words. The slave, indifferent, replied that the thought had never crossed her mind, but he insisted she should reflect, as words were important, and with irony, she said she'd think about it after killing him, which made him laugh. Then the knight invited her to fight and in a swift move charged toward her. In seconds, the slave's sword blade shattered, revealing it had been sabotaged. That unexpected sound caught her off guard, and her eyes widened as she realized the trap. The knight then burst into laughter, mocking her for trusting a weapon given by an enemy and shouted for her to die. However, before he could take advantage, the slave struck him with the hilt of the sword, snapping his head back. With the knight on the ground, she approached, tossed aside the broken sword's hilt, and announced it was time to kill him. The fool, in disbelief, asked how she could be so calm, and she coldly asked if those could be considered his last words. Defeated and humiliated, the knight just clenched his teeth, consumed by fury and fear of that woman, and so he dashed past her as fast as he could. Suddenly, a sharp scream echoed through the area, drawing the slave's attention. Taking advantage of the distraction, the knight composed himself and ordered the village girl not to move. Grabbing her from behind, he placed the blade at her neck and threatened her, asking the slave if she didn't care what might happen to the hostage. However, to everyone's surprise, the slave leapt at him with a flying double kick, stating she was totally fine with it. That cold and unexpected answer left the knight in shock, but all he could think about at that moment was the slave's foot coming closer and closer. Soon after, a thud was heard in the distance. Defeated, the knight lamented his own stupidity for trying to take all the credit. In a final attempt, he threatened her, saying that if she killed him, even more terrifying knights would come after her. The slave, however, just said he could reflect on that in the afterlife. Shortly after, our hero approached the woman and asked if she was okay, to which she confirmed. While in the background, the fool was being brutally stomped by the slave. The country girl then commented to the commoner about the cowardice of that soldier, and expressed the hope that her younger brother wouldn't turn out like him. Upon hearing that, the commoner lowered his head with an expression of deep sorrow and soon changed the subject to her brother, curious to know his name, hoping he might have met him at some point. Then, she began to mention his name, even making the slave pause to listen. And in that instant, a heavy silence fell over them. Excited, she turned to him, asking how he knew her younger brother, to which the commoner replied that he surely had been a great man. Confused, the woman didn't understand the connection, and he then explained that her brother was the reason a commoner like him was able to become a knight. However, unable to keep the half-truth, he finally confessed to her that he had been the one who killed him. The woman in disbelief asked if he was joking, but the commoner explained that it was because of her brother's death that his deeds had been recognized, and with the weight of guilt he apologized. With her face covered in tears, the woman raised her hand and with a trembling voice asked him not to apologize. Then she picked up the sword from the ground and confessed that if he asked for forgiveness, she might end up forgiving him. Ignoring the warning, the commoner, eyes lowered, insisted on his apology. The woman, voice trembling, repeated that he shouldn't apologize. Even so, he persisted, claiming the blame was all his. His insistence finally broke the woman's composure, and she exploded in fury. Blinded by anger and pain, she raised the sword and attacked in a desperate blow. However, in a swift move, the slave stepped in, shielding her master. Lying on the ground, the commoner just kept watching everything around him with his usual impassive gaze. Shocked by the outcome, he then asked her, wanting to know why she had killed the woman. The slave looked at him and with impressive coldness replied that she did what she did because he had shown no initiative. While carrying him away on her back, the slave sarcastically commented that if he intended to apologize, maybe he shouldn't have killed, but she quickly questioned ironically how a mere slave could possibly understand the noble thoughts of a commoner. The commoner remarked that it was the first time he had heard her be sarcastic, but she denied it, claiming to be far too dull for that and that she didn't have a single sarcastic bone in her body. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the Lord's daughter received news of the knight's death and furious questioned how that could have happened. At that moment, a new knight approached and kneeling asked her to leave that matter to him. With a confident smile, he assured her he would certainly bring back the heads of those scoundrels. The young noble woman, still skeptical, asked if she could truly trust that he would succeed. He in turn simply confirmed with remarkable confidence. Far away the journey continued, and the commoner, exhausted, let out a long sigh as he was carried by the slave. Upon reaching the gates of a large city, he expressed hope of finding decent lodging. The slave, however, suggested looking for a comfortable spot under a bridge near the river, which left him confused. But before they could proceed, a familiar voice interrupted them. It was a little girl who, holding a mug in her hands, welcomed them to that remote country. With a gentle smile, the little girl said that even though she didn't know them, they were still her guests. She then offered them a drink, commenting that they must be thirsty after the long journey through such desolate lands. She extended the cup with that country's water and asked them to drink. The commoner, however, interrupted and asked if she knew she was offering them dirty water, but then accepted it out of politeness. The girl in turn said she was humbly honored by their acceptance, explaining that the sacred water contained the divine blessings of God himself. Around them, hooded figures murmured prayers to the god of springs, asking Latona-sama to pour her blessing on everyone present. Soon the duo found themselves surrounded by a crowd of faithful who in fervent unison cried out for water. In the background, the shadow of a towering cathedral loomed, making it clear that religion ruled every aspect of that place. The little girl then guided them to what was called the sacred spring of Latona-sama, showing the herbs growing nearby as a sign of the blessing. But the slave disdainfully mocked the excess, which led the commoner to tell her to shut her mouth at the provocation. As they walked through the city, they noticed an isolated well, and the girl explained it had been dug by a group opposed to devotion to Leona. The commoner asked what that faction was, and the girl clarified that by nature, water tends to gather impurities, and therefore water without divine protection like that from the well shouldn't be consumed. She continued saying that even with the divine spring in existence, the faction had the audacity to dig a well, which angered the gods. Because of this, the gods now ruled the city and strictly forbade the use of any well. Soon, the commoner asked what would happen if someone used one of the wells, to which the slave sarcastically replied that it would probably be death. The girl then confirmed that people did die and explained that it was a necessary and unavoidable act to prevent the spread of impurities. As night fell over the city, a new visitor approached the gates. It was the knight sent by the Lord's daughter who analyzed his next step. He suspected that the scoundrels he sought were hiding in that city and wondered where he should start searching. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps made him turn, interrupting his thoughts. Then, the same little girl as before called out to him and even without recognizing him, welcomed him to that remote country and said he was a guest. After offering him the local water, the knight tasted it and disgusted asked what that dirty water was. Upon learning it was the holy water of Latona-sama, he didn't hide his disdain and sarcastically criticized the townspeople's faith. Next, he shattered the cup on the ground, declaring it was disgusting and that the least they could have done was offer him water from a proper well. However, that act of blasphemy caught everyone's attention, and all eyes fixed on the knight. Instead of anger, the little girl in the crowd behind her, began chanting a bizarre hymn about happy water. Surrounded, the knight drew his sword and frightened asked if they wanted to fight, boasting that he was a genius swordsman from the army. He tried to shout his name to intimidate them, but his voice was completely drowned out by the deafening chanting of the crowd. Soon after, the knight's decapitated head was displayed atop the forbidden well, and the commoner realized that Latona's faction had used him as an example. One of the villagers lamented the poor guy, saying he didn't know who he was, but cursed the cult group. Then the same man turned to the commoner and his slave when asked if he was part of the anti-Latona group. The man clarified that it was just the name the devotees gave to anyone who wasn't one of them and stated that the city's residents were tired of not being able to use the well. With that, the man confronted them, asking if they were one of them, to which the commoner tried to quickly deny. At the gate, a barrel was knocked over, spilling its contents onto the ground. The noise drew the attention of two hooded cultists who immediately confronted a young woman, accusing her of having drawn water from the well and of defying the will of Latona-sama. Desperate, the girl explained that the water was for her sick mother and that she just wanted her mom to drink some clean water. One of the cultists, however, said that was even more reason to use the sacred water, ignoring her protests. Through tears, she shouted that her mother would die if she drank that dirty water from the spring. Ignoring her plea, the cultist grabbed her forcefully, growling that she would pay for such audacity as he began the punishment chant. At that exact moment, the commoner intervened, grabbing the cultist's arm and declaring they had gone too far. The lunatic turned, surprised by the unexpected interference. The man who was talking to them earlier was shocked, asking who that guy was who had jumped in on one foot. Meanwhile, the slave muttered that commoners shouldn't act on their own. After a brief fight, the townspeople gathered around the duo, impressed that they had defeated the cult members alone. They declared their saviors had arrived, but the commoner tried to explain that hadn't been their intention and was quickly invited inside so as not to attract more cultists. Now sheltered, one of the men offered well water to the slave in thanks. She, however, with her usual disdain asked if they really expected a slave like her to drink that water, prompting the commoner to tell the man to just ignore her. Later, as night wore on, the town's peace was about to be shattered. Suddenly the door of the house they were in burst open and a man shouted desperately for everyone to come outside. The commoner quickly asked, startled, what was going on. And as they left the house they were met with a gruesome scene where a hand stretched out amid several bodies scattered on the ground. Surrounded by the other villagers, the commoner asked what the hell that was. One of the men, annoyed, said it had happened again, explaining it was a warning from the cult of Leona. They captured the rebels, poisoned them, and sent them back to the city as an example. Another villager added that by nightfall, the bodies would be everywhere, all having vomited blood, a method he said was even more effective at spreading terror than placing heads on stakes. That's when the commoner, looking closer at the bodies, was struck brutally. Lying among the victims was the little cult girl agonizing from the poison. Shocked, the commoner called to his slave and asked if she would help him destroy those people. The question caught her off guard, and she commented that it was unexpected. However, right after, she firmly replied that he didn't even need to ask. Soon after, they invaded the cathedral and found the little girl in the middle of a ceremony. She asked what they wanted, explaining that it was a memorial for the followers they had killed, but with contempt the commoner asked if they mourned their dead, but not the villagers they murdered, and thus confirmed they couldn't be changed. After easily defeating the cultists present, the slave commented on how weak they were. The commoner agreed, saying only someone pathetically weak would lose to them. With the little girl locked in a cell, our hero confronted her about the executions and suspicious use of poison. But she seemed confused by the accusation. She vehemently denied it, stating they had never used poison. The commoner, however, didn't believe her. He told her to stop pretending not to understand, saying that wouldn't ease the weight of her sins, and that she should take responsibility for the lives she'd taken. The girl then swore it was the truth, admitting that they had indeed publicly executed many residents who drank the contaminated well water. However, she hesitated and reaffirmed her innocence, solemnly swearing in the holy name of Latona-sama that they had never used poison. The commoner, however, remained skeptical and asked what made her think he would believe a vow to a god who, to him, didn't exist. Sometime later, with the situation resolved, the duo left the city, while the grateful townspeople wished them a good journey for having returned their water. And so, they left that village with the slave once again carrying her master on her back. The truth, however, was simpler than it seemed, for wells, by their very nature, were prone to contamination. Animal waste and insects easily dirted the stagnant water, making it dangerous. The well in that town was no exception, and the water it provided had long since become unfit for consumption. On the other hand, the sacred spring had one advantage. Thanks to the herbs that grew abundantly around it, animals and insects didn't come near, and thus the water remained pure and clean. Although it was all just a coincidence, some might say the spring was indeed divinely protected, and it was this belief that gave rise to the cult of Leona. However, the commoner and his slave had no way of knowing any of that. Far away, the Lord's daughter was informed that the genius swordsman had yet to return. Suddenly, another soldier entered the hall. He was a man with a stern appearance who introduced himself by asking if he had been summoned. The young noblewoman looked at him with disdain, muttering that, as always, she had no idea what went on behind that expressionless face. And indeed, the man's face was unreadable and cold. Meanwhile, on the road, the commoner was panting from exhaustion. The slave commented on his breathing and teased him for being such a delicate commoner. Our hero in turn said his leg hurt. She then suggested they take a short break and said she would look for something to eat, to which he agreed. As she walked off, she wondered if there would be anything around that a delicate commoner like him would find appetizing. Suddenly, she heard a meow coming from the darkness of the bushes. Next, a stray cat cautiously approached her. The feline stared at her and let out another meow, looking a bit wild. Shortly after, the slave returned and called out to the commoner, who responded curiously. Holding the cat by the scruff, she proudly announced that dinner would include meat. The commoner, horrified, ordered her to let it go. With the cat now on her master's shoulder, the slave looked offended, asking if she had just heard a commoner insult her. He apologized, but also scolded her for speaking so recklessly about eating the animal. Suddenly, the slave's attention was caught by a smell in the air. She told the commoner she smelled smoke, which could mean a campfire, and people nearby. With that, she suggested they might be able to find a doctor for his leg. However, just ahead, she stopped abruptly, planting her foot on the ground. And well, what they saw in front of them was horrifying. Before them, a human was being burned in a public square. Horrified, the commoner wondered if that too was some kind of punishment. Suddenly, a group of men in cloaks and carrying spears surrounded them, demanding to know who they were. One of them asked if they were outsiders, but his attention was immediately captured by the black cat on the commoner's shoulder. The man then turned to the slave and accused her of being a witch. He explained that a witch's curse was spreading across the country, a disease that started with black spots and led to a terrible death within 2 days. Because of this, they were hunting all witches in the region and getting rid of their familiars, the cats. And with that, he declared that the feline would be dinner that night. He then pointed at the slave and said she would be no exception, and that they would kill her, too. The slave, however, planted her feet firmly, preparing for another battle, and grumbled about how annoying they were. But then she suddenly stopped advancing. Her eyes widened as she realized how serious the situation was. In a moment of distraction, one of the witch hunters appeared behind her and raised his weapon, ready to strike the slave, whom he insultingly called a commoner. Shortly after, the poor girl woke up tied to a stake while everyone around screamed at her. Feeling the heat of the approaching flames, she let out a groan. However, her strategy still stood, and she claimed that as soon as the ropes burned, she would take them all to hell with her. The men, however, ignored her threat, saying they wouldn't be fooled by the witch's bluff. Upon hearing that, the slave closed her eyes, accepting her fate. But she quickly opened them again when she saw one of her reasons for staying alive approaching. Unable to watch what was happening, the commoner dragged himself to the stake, and with the little strength he had, tried to stop the execution. The man already had the torch lit, ready to set her on fire. But just as he threatened the commoner, the slave without hesitation kicked him square in the jaw and screamed desperately, begging them to stop. The witch hunter was shocked by her reaction, finding it absurd that she cared about someone else. Then the commoner grabbed his leg. Irritated by their stubbornness, the hunter grumbled and began stomping on the poor commoner's head over and over. The ensuing violence left the slave terrified, and her eyes widened as she realized where her actions had led her master. Horrified, the poor girl screamed with all her strength for them to stop. Suddenly, a powerful figure emerged amid the chaos. It was the warrior sent by the noble king's daughter, who arrived decapitating the fool who was stomping on the commoner. The hunters, caught off guard, tried to figure out who the stranger was. But one of them quickly declared that since he had intervened for the witch, they had no choice but to kill him too. So the men charged, shouting, surrounding the newcomer. However, they were no match for this warrior who with lightning-fast moves took them all down at once. Amid the fallen hunters, the man turned to the slave and asked if she was the one he had been looking for. The slave looked at him and quickly concluded, surprised, that he was one of her pursuers. In the calm that followed, the cat, now safe, approached and let out a meow. And well, the cat, whom the slave had previously named Meat, was surprisingly an enemy, too. When she got the name wrong, the madman corrected her, stating that his name was actually Pluto. The knight then lifted the small animal in his hands and with apparent tenderness commented on how clever Pluto was. And well, that cat was none other than his pet. With that, the warrior kept petting the cat, but in the blink of an eye, the madman's hands bulged with veins. And in a swift motion, he snapped the animal's neck, its last weak meow echoing as the slave watched in shock at the cruelty. With chilling coldness, he simply dropped the lifeless body at the woman's feet. Seeing that, the slave remarked that he seemed like a real cat lover, and with that demanded to know why he had killed it. The warrior, however, wondered if having a reason would make any difference and asked if she would believe him if he tried to justify his actions. Then he said maybe he had gotten annoyed by the cat's meow or simply lost his taste for it, and asked if something so trivial would be an acceptable excuse. He then confronted her, asking if to survive she had any idea how many living beings she had killed. And since she didn't, the knight concluded that he killed without thinking. He claimed that to survive people were capable of killing anyone, their pets, lovers, parents, friends, or even their own children. As he raised his sword, he declared that, in his view, everyone should be able to kill without hesitation, no matter who the victim was. His words, however, were cut off by the slave's furious scream as she launched herself in defense. Even with her feet still tied by the PY ropes, she managed to block his sword. She was so quick that this single move broke the rope in half. Now free, she launched into the attack. However, instead of rage, the warrior showed surprise and even admiration for her move. He stepped back a little and, seeing her pitiful condition, remarked on her boldness to attack him even while bound, deciding to use his sword to cut the rest of the ropes that held her. With that, her hands were finally freed. The knight in turn examined her with a critical gaze, saying that while she was brave, she didn't have proper combat posture, and that her fighting style was useless against a real warrior. To prove his point, he easily dodged her next attack, ignoring his superiority. The slave kept attacking furiously, landing an awkward kick that the knight watched with indifference. Next, she tried to grab him with her hands, believing for a moment she could surprise him with her speed. The woman shouted in a desperate effort. The knight, however, remained calm, his analytical eyes tracking her every predictable move. Soon, her charge was abruptly halted by the warrior, who used only the hilt of his sword to knock the air out of her, causing her to collapse to the ground, coughing as she tried to recover. Standing over her, he let out a long sigh, seeming disappointed with the quick outcome of the fight. However, the slave didn't give up and asked him to wait. But instead of begging for her life, she asked him to hurry up and end it. Then she asked if, by taking her head as proof, her master would be spared. And well, the offer seemed to pique the knight's curiosity. She then tried to take all the blame, claiming that she had attacked the lord's daughter, and that her master had nothing to do with the incident. Upon hearing that, the knight sheathed his sword. The slave then asked why he had stopped the attack, but he only responded evasively, asking what good it would do her to know the reason. With a mysterious look, he then offered a shocking explanation, asking if she would be satisfied if he said he had fallen in love with her. The knight then turned his back on her and slowly walked away. Stunned by what was about to happen, the slave's eyes widened. She begged the knight to stop, but the warrior ignored her plea and kept walking toward the commoner. The poor girl begged him to show mercy, but it was no use, and the lunatic kept moving forward. With her face drenched in tears, she screamed desperately for him to stop. Completely ignoring the pleas, the knight slowly drew his sword. He then stood over the commoner's defenseless body, holding the blade with authority. Indifferent to everything that makes someone human, the warrior looked at him with chilling coldness. But then he returned the sword to its sheath without saying a word. Now hopeless, the slave remained on the ground, merely watching everything unfold. Next, the warrior crouched and in a humiliating gesture grabbed the commoner by the hair, lifting his head off the ground. Meanwhile, the warrior stared at him with a blank gaze. Then, with a grunt of disdain, he let the commoner's head drop with a thud onto the ground. And well, the sound of the slave's teeth chattering in fear was the only thing echoing in that terrifying silence. Trembling, she asked him why he was being so cruel. But the knight simply ordered her not to ask questions and warned her not to make him repeat himself, as he hated wasting time on meaningless talk. And with that, while calling her barefoot slave, the knight finally walked away. Meanwhile, the slave's teeth continued to tremble in terror. She tried to stand, but her weakened and shaken body collapsed again. Unable to hold itself upright, unable to stay on her feet, she fell to the ground once more. Then a painful memory came to her mind as she realized the leather shoes her master had given her had been left behind, forgotten in the mansion. Shortly after, while the rain fell over them, the slave, now carrying her master on her back, asked if he was okay and if the rain was bothering his wounds, to which he confirmed he was fine. She then warned him that it might get bumpy and asked him to hang on, praising his resilience and saying that was expected of her master. With a determined look, she told the commoner that they should finally go home. In a moment of peace, the slave asked her master for permission to share an old story, and with his approval, she thanked him with a small laugh. She then said that the country where she was born didn't have a name. In fact, she thought the country probably had a name, but no one around her knew it. Indeed, most people who lived there didn't even know their own names. Instead, they called each other by their social status or physical traits. And of course, she confessed it was no different for her. Looking even further back, she revealed that her earliest memory was the foul taste of trash and the smell of blood. That smell, she explained, came from a man who turned out to be a human trafficker, and the victim he had killed, it seemed, had tried to escape. She said that at the time, she wandered aimlessly with no purpose, living only by the basic instinct of survival. And things stayed that way for a long and uncertain time. Since her only goal was to avoid death, she chose to obey and simply accept whatever happened to her without question. That was when she first heard the word that would define who she was on this new path: a simple slave. Her kidnapper sold her to a slave merchant, and from that day on, she became just another item in a shop, constantly passed from one noble to another. Her tasks ranged from farm work and house chores to serving as a release for her master's stress and fulfilling nighttime duties. Her life changed completely, and she began living not for herself but for others. And when she thought about her own exhaustion, she came to a surprising conclusion. The poor girl wondered how such a gratifying job could exist, and with a twisted smile on her face told herself that being a slave was amazing. And so, to become even more useful, she learned the complexities of the noble language and took on the name slave with a sense of pride. She even trained her body daily, all so she could better protect her current master. However, despite all her efforts, something always went wrong in the end. Even the nobles who worked her to the bone, or those who pampered her out of pity for her looks, ended up saying that having a slave wasn't worth it, and she was quickly discarded. Then before her, just a slave who had completely lost her value. The commoner finally appeared. The life she had from that moment on, she reflected, was filled with such joy that it felt like a waste for Heir's slave to even try to describe it. So she asked the commoner to let them from then on, and for the rest of their days keep sharing moments so wonderful that they could hardly be put into words. In response, her master, still weak, murmured in agreement with her proposal. Far away back at the mansion, the Lord's daughter was yelling impatiently, demanding to know why the knight she had sent hadn't returned yet. With her face twisted in rage, she demanded to know why no one had yet brought the fugitives' heads to her door. At that moment, someone appeared in the corridor, stammering an apology. Suddenly, a servant came running behind and shouted urgently about intruders on the property. Annoyed by the interruption, the young noblewoman asked who the intruders were, how many of them there were, and complained that they were already too busy. And well, the figure in the hall responded hesitantly, saying he wasn't even sure they could be counted as two people. The vague answer made her furious, and she turned around yelling that she couldn't understand a single word of what he was trying to say. But a noise soon made her stop complaining and fall silent. Then the intruder revealed herself. It was the slave walking barefoot through the hall. She rudely called out to the Lord's daughter, and with a determined gaze declared that she was only there to retrieve her leather shoes. Hearing her, the noblewoman realized the knight she had sent had failed, and that it had all been an act, which made her even more furious. The slave then said she didn't care what she thought and just ordered her to hurry up and bring her the shoes. Blinded by rage, the young woman ordered the slave to shut up and threatened to kill them both. But her threat died in the air as her expression of fury turned into confusion when she noticed something. She then pointed at the slave's back and asked what exactly she was carrying. The slave, however, corrected her, asking if her master looked like luggage. But the young noble revealed the truth to the slave. The commoner was already dead. The slave didn't understand asking what she meant by that. Seeing the absurd scene, the Lord's daughter asked what part she wasn't getting. Then, while taking small steps, the poor girl insisted that he had been responding to what she was saying. But the young noblewoman shouted that any sound he made was just air leaving his lungs. That left the noble stunned. That was when her eyes fixed on the commoner's leg and she finally saw the black mark of the disease that had killed him. Ignoring the horrible truth, the slave explained that her master's leg hurt and that they just wanted to go home. She then turned to the noblewoman and promised she wouldn't hurt her as long as she could get the shoes. Saying that, she stepped forward, her barefoot touching the cold floor of the hall. The Lord's daughter, however, remained paralyzed, unsure how to respond. Impatiently, the slave ordered her to hurry and tell her where the shoes were. Completely intimidated, the young woman finally answered, saying the shoes were in her master's room. Upon hearing the answer, a piercing look turned toward her, and it was at that moment that the noble realized what she had truly done. As she turned to leave, the slave thanked her, calling her a little bastard. And so, carrying her master's body, she walked down the long hallway, leaving the traumatized noble behind. In the room, she laid her master's body on the bed. The carriage driver complimented his sword, to which he agreed. The warrior then explained that the sword belonged to a kingdom he no longer served, and that he had no intention of dying as a knight, which surprised the driver. The man apologized and said that, in the end, no matter how much you paid, no one wanted to get involved in trouble. The knight said it didn't matter and mentioned that many thought his expression was intimidating, but that was just a result of his insomnia. He revealed that he used to get hit in the head with a hammer, which kept him from sleeping. And to the driver's surprise, the knight said that in the near future, the kingdom would be destroyed. Shocked by the revelation, the driver asked how he could know something like that. The warrior then explained that the government was already in the hands of a strange boy and stated that in that world, you couldn't get rich by living to help others. That's why he concluded that people like him could only live for themselves. And with a final thought, he said goodbye to the one-legged knight and the slave with leather shoes, saying he'd see them again soon. Meanwhile, the memory of the note she left for her master came to the slave's mind along with the hope she once felt of being able to live for others and also be appreciated. In that memory, she felt cornered because she had just dropped a plate and the commoner's voice in the background asked what had happened. The slave then entered a dramatic monologue shouting that it was unthinkable for a slave to break her master's property, and so declared that she should pay with her own life. But in a sudden impulse, she turned her back to him and asked him to wait a moment. Moments later, she returned with a brand new plate, saying she had learned from a local artisan and managed to create a perfect replica of one of his works. The commoner, impressed, commented on the girl's insane talent, but said she was a bit crazy.